Welcome to All People's Health Collective podcast number one. My name is Lex Steppling. I'm with the All People's Health Collective and the Los Angeles Community Action Network, and really pleased to be here and joined by my comrade, John Raphling. Welcome, John.
Hey, thanks, Lex. Great to be here, and great to be part of the first podcast for All People's Health Collective. I am a researcher at Human Rights Watch, and we're going to be talking about uh, my most recent report released last August about the criminalization of unhoused people in Los Angeles, and talking about how it impacts all things about our communities in our city and our nation, and particularly bringing it back to how it impacts mental health and housing in the carceral system.
That's right. And as Mike Davis, I think, tried to tell us almost 40 years ago, that Los Angeles is essentially the neoliberal endgame. It all rolled west and landed in LA. And everything that happens in LA becomes a kind of microcosm and petri dish for what happens in the rest of the country. So unfortunately for us, and maybe fortunately for our analysis, everything in LA matters. Do you want to start us off quickly with a little bit of background? I think sometimes these reports get presented as if they just got created in a lab and delivered, when in truth it's coming out of generations of struggle. And do you want to give us a little of that storytelling, and if you will, how it connects to your background when you started doing work in LA?
Sure. Well, I started in LA when I first came out to LA. I was a tenant organizer in Venice, working with tenants in subsidized housing in a housing development that was um, built by the longstanding Black community in Los Angeles as a way to stay in that community. And what's happened in that community in the Oakwood neighborhood of Venice is it's been greatly gentrified and become uh, now it's filled with multi-million-dollar homes, but the HUD subsidized buildings are still there, and there's still a presence and a community of multi-generations of people who lived in those buildings. So that was kind of my start, was as a tenant rights advocate. I then worked in the public defender's office. I became a lawyer and worked in the public defender's office, and found that a huge percentage of my clients were unhoused or on the brink of houselessness, and that was in some ways a contributing factor, and often a large contributing factor, to why they were in the courts and facing jail and prison time. After I left the public defender's office as a private lawyer, I worked a lot around these issues, as both in criminal defense and as a civil rights lawyer, and actually started with some community organizers, a free legal clinic out of LA Can, and with the Venice Justice Committee, to help unhoused people who are getting ticketed and fined for the simple act of being on the streets. And so all that background came together when I became a researcher at Human Rights Watch. I saw this as one of the major human rights issues that we face in this country, right? There is a human right to housing. There is a human right to healthcare, and not coerced healthcare, but healthcare that we have autonomous control over, that we choose and that fits our needs. And all of these things these rights are being denied through the through the lack of housing for people, and that's a function of housing as a commercial value, sort of if you would, a capitalist housing market, as opposed to a rights-based approach to housing, and similar in healthcare. Anyway, so all those things brought me to want to do this report.
What just curious, I'm curious, what year were you doing the tenants organizing in Oakwood? What years?
In the late 80s and into 1990.
So just as a funny personal aside, while John Raphling was organizing tenants in Oakwood, Venice, I was living there, probably around the corner in Oakwood, Venice, at the same time as probably a 6, 7 year old child. So we go way back, John.
We do. I'm sure we and your family would have crossed paths.
Sure, I'm sure. And that was, that moment is one of the, again, we talk about LA as this constant place of workshopping of state violence. It is the incubator of so much state violence that gets exported to the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And we should talk sometime in the future, but the story of Oakwood, Venice is a really important story connected to that. It was one of the last working class, predominantly Black beachside communities in Los Angeles, and was one of the first places where they really employed so much of the militarized police that we talk about today, as far as how forceful displacement was used, using the war on drugs criminalization as the kind of both metaphorical and literal boot to the door to kick it down and get into the community.
Yeah, we can do a whole other podcast on that. It's um uh quite a history.
So this report, I'm excited to jump into it. I feel like a lot of the motivations for this report was the fact that we know the housing crisis in Los Angeles and the rest of the country, the crisis of unhoused, of homelessness, gets talked about every which way but correctly. And it's loaded with so many agendas, so much dishonesty, and so much, propaganda, if you will, and then propaganda on the side of kind of, land use interests as well. And I could go on and on. And this report is so important because this was actually an honest and earnest look. And so would love to jump into it, but also quick, I keep asking for context, but it feels important. You really got on the ground and walked around the streets of LA talking to people, right?
Yeah, so I'm gonna put up the first slide, um, which has a little bit of background on the report. The report's really long. Every word of it's wonderful. So, we'll read a few pages at a time, read a section at a time. But yeah, the most important thing about the report is the process, and it took over 3 years. The process involved talking to experts. And some of the experts are policy people, professors, organizers, city council members. I talked to the mayor. Right, these are people who have an angle and have some expertise. But the primary experts that I spoke to about 150 people total, a little more than that. But over 100 of them, their expertise was gained from actually having lived on the streets. They were either people who were currently living on the streets or in their cars or in shelters, or people who had experienced that in their lives. And so that really, these are the people who actually know what's going on. They know how they ended up on the streets. They know what they're dealing with every day. Another part of it was just spending a lot of time myself out there witnessing sweeps, witnessing how the services sector operated, witnessing how the police operated towards unhoused people. And finally, we got a ton of data from various city and county agencies, from the LAPD, from the sanitation department, from LAHSA, which is Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, uh, and from the city itself, and doing some pretty in-depth analysis of that data, and finding and looking at that data in context of what people on the streets were saying. Um, and so the data analysis is very much informed by what we call the qualitative research, which is actual hearing from people themselves. So I think that's kind of the big value. We also look at it through the lens of international human rights law, as opposed to it being kind of stuck with the US framework, which is very narrow. compared to the international human rights law framework.
Can you quickly tell us the difference? What makes one less narrow, more narrow?
I would say that human rights law is much more aspirational. It it poses fundamental rights, particularly in the, let's say, quality of life realm. So under human rights law, there's a right to housing, very different from the right to, say, shelter that some people talk about when they say the right to housing. The right to housing, and it's not just there's a right to housing, but there's a right to housing that people can afford, that people can stay in with some permanence, that has amenities, has electricity, running water, things of that matter, that's accessible, that's um, you know, culturally appropriate, all of these things. Whereas in U.S. law, there is no right. There's things like there's a right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizure, right? Some of the constitutional rights that are very limited and are totally dependent on what judge you're in front of to interpret what's reasonable and what's not. And we could probably spend hours talking about the history of how U.S. law evolved, but it's very responsive to property interests, and is not about making sure that all people have health and welfare and the ability to sort of live a comfortable enough life. Whereas human rights law is more about that, in addition to political rights like free speech, the right to organize, and the right to assemble, and things of that matter.
So this may be an elementary question, but are you saying, because I realize I don't know this, is the term, housing is a human right, is that nowhere in any of our kind of constitutional language at a federal or state level?
So it's definitely not in the federal constitution. Um, there have been efforts to say put it in the California Constitution, and there actually is a last year there was a legislative effort, one to put a ballot measure on, and so there have been efforts. I'm not sure. I couldn't say for every state whether there have been that succeeded, and there's a lot of talk about it. And the more we talk about it, the more that's important, right? We should normalize the idea that there's a right to housing, there's a right to health care, that all these things should exist. But so far, we haven't had the political will and the political organizing to make that happen.
And it begs really important points and questions about what then becomes the value when these things are adopted into language and charters, but does that actually deliver material impacts, or in some ways help mediate momentum towards them? It's a deeper question, but part of All People's Health Collective's existence is we want to cut through the language and begin demanding these human rights get implemented. But that's a really important contrast. So yeah, happy to get back into the report.
Yeah. So let me pop up the next slide for a moment. So the report starts with a discussion of, like, what's the state of houselessness in Los Angeles, and it's pretty bleak. The official counts, and they go up and go down. The last count went down a little bit. There's around 75,000 people living on streets, in shelters, in their vehicles, in the parks. In Los Angeles County, 46,000 in the city alone. A vast undercount. And we know it's a vast undercount because, well, there's a variety of reasons that I won't get into, but you can read it in the report. But they count on one day, or I think for this count, they counted over a 3-day stretch in the middle of winter, which is when people are hiding, and people hide in general. And that's one of the themes of the report, is that the policy is done to make unhoused people as invisible as possible, rather than actually get people housed and address their needs. but LA, you talked about earlier how, everything kind of LA is such an important central point to the whole country. LA County itself, as one single county, has 7% of the unhoused population in the whole country, which is just kind of a shocking number. And significantly, it's almost three-quarters of people are unsheltered, meaning they're just on out on the streets. Um, and at the time of the report, just to bring home how devastating this is, at the time of the report, the average daily death toll of people on the streets, and death from a variety of factors, but that ultimately can be boiled down to it's really hard living on the streets. It wears on one's health dramatically. The death toll was 6 on average. I haven't yet read the report, but there's a new accounting, and that's up to around 7 as of now. So this is a crisis that's killing people, and we're taking the wrong approaches, let's just say.
The
And I know, Lex, I know that you're with Can, you're out at Skid Row a lot and just in your community work in general. And would be interesting to hear sort of your perspective on what you're seeing in terms of the reality today.
it's interesting because I mean, Skid Row is where it's most articulated, where it's most clear and obvious because people are living on the street. And Skid Row finds itself also in this very precarious position now because gentrification has exacerbated every aspect of this, where Skid Row finds itself squeezed between. It's kind of it's viewed by developers and those with an interest in gentrification as this really frustrating speed bump where it exists between these two areas. They want to bridge the gap and create a kind of urban theme park for the wealthy. And that's again its own conversation about how does a community fight for its survival. Skid Row is a place of people, and it's one of the most important communities in Los Angeles, and it gets framed as a blight when it's not. But what it is an articulation of many societal failures at once, while also, I should say, an articulation of community and resiliency. It's the most neighborly community in LA. It's one of the last places left in LA where everyone says good morning and how you doing too. But it also, in some ways, helps present this very stark example of what your report was talking about. And so I really appreciated you saying it's a vast undercount because we know it's an undercount, but it also isn't including these counts very purposely exclude those dealing with housing instability. What if we also included people having to stay with relatives or stay with friends in short-term situations, jumping from, place to place, couch surfing, if you will, combined with those on the verge of it? The other thing that happened is that Los Angeles has effectively become unlivable. The rents keep going up. Mortgage rates never went down. So people who bought houses thinking a year later they'd be able to afford them can't afford them anymore. A lot of folks are caught on the edge right now. So that can I guess be seen as a separate category. But people couch surfing or are at the mercy of others needing to stay with them and all that comes with that are not included in this count. And I'm not going to ask you to offer an estimate of numbers, but I would imagine we both agree it's far more than what gets listed here if you consider that as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point, right? And the numbers are bad enough, right? 75,000 in the county. And so the numbers are useful in that sense because they give baseline is the wrong word, but it gives at least an idea of relative, right? How from year to year, or from decade to decade, the numbers are relatively changing. But to your point, on that given day when they're doing the count, how many people have um, managed, because it's really cold, because they usually do it in January, have managed to you know, get a friend to let them stay in their garage or on their couch for the night, or have pooled money together to get a cheap hotel room for the night, but they're back on the streets the next day. They just don't get counted. And another really important factor, and we'll get to it later as we talk, is that it's not safe to be visible on the streets. It's not safe both because people living on the streets are more likely than those not to be victimized by other people, by crime, by vigilantes, right? A lot of people spoke to me about vigilantes coming at them. But also, and this is really the exceedingly disturbing part, but by government officials, right? It's not safe because you might get arrested or ticketed, or just harassed by police. You might have all your stuff thrown away by the sanitation department. And so a lot of people make themselves very hard to find for a good reason. And so the count, they may be doing their best to find people, but they're not going to find all the many people who are who are in hiding, as well as the people who have managed to get indoors for the night. So it is a vast undercount. You also bring up, and I'm going to move to the next slide if I can figure out how to do that. There we go. Let me see. Here we go. There we go. My technological incompetence is showing, but I got it. Is you discuss people who are on the edge, right? And in the report we get into and break down a lot of the numbers, and you can read the numbers in the report, but there are literally hundreds of thousands of people who are what's called cost burdened. Cost burden means that they're paying more than they can reasonably afford for housing. Cost burden is defined if you're paying more than 30% of your income, of what you take in, for housing costs. And then extreme cost burden is if you're paying more than 50%. We have literally hundreds of thousands of people in Los Angeles who are extremely cost burdened, which means that they're, one missed paycheck or an unexpected medical bill, or a traffic accident that they got to pay, or even a ticket that they have to pay, away from losing their housing. Similarly, we have hundreds of thousands of people living in overcrowded situations, right, where there's too many people for the number of rooms that they have to live in, and most of these people are not on the lease, and so can be kicked out, or that overcrowding can be a lease violation in itself, which can lead to eviction, or they're simply there at the at the whim of somebody else, and they're can be kicked out quite easily and end up on the streets. Los Angeles leads the country in these categories. If they don't lead the country, they're like the second highest. It's a huge problem here, and the fact of the matter is that the housing costs, and you already alluded to it, have just gone way up, and wages at the high end have also gone way up, which is part of why housing costs have gone so high. But wages for regular working class people have been stagnant for decades. And so the housing costs are out of reach. And there's a lot of data in the report about how the median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, you'd have to be earning some number of multiples of minimum wage to be able to afford a place like that. And actually, I don't put much stock in consultants like McKinsey, but McKinsey did a study that's been backed up by other
If
studies.
McKinsey's saying it, it's true.
Of course. Well, if they're saying it, they're probably understating the problem here. But they're saying that Los Angeles needs 500,000 more affordable units. I'm going to repeat that: 500,000 more affordable units. And this is this is
Staggering.
really, it is staggering. And I'm not the one who invented this analogy, but I'm going to run with it. Is think of a game of musical chairs, right? The kids game, where you walk around and there's 10 people and there's only 9 chairs, and when the music stops, you got to find a place to sit. And the 10th person who doesn't get to a chair in time has to, it loses. We're out 500,000 chairs here, right? So a certain number of people are going to be unhoused. And this is a really critical point, because the logic of criminalization is about, well, you're living on the streets because of something that you did wrong and some flaw with you, right? You're a drug user, you're lazy, you're mentally ill, right? All these things that it's your pathology and your problem. But wait a second, we're short 500,000 housing units. Somebody's not going to have a place to live, right? Now, somebody with a disability that makes it harder for them to work and lacking a social safety net, they're more likely to be one of the people that doesn't get a home, right? Somebody who's lost a job similarly is going to be more likely. But the structural reason why we have such houselessness is the lack of affordable housing. And I'm leaving the picture up on the screen because this picture I took while going out on the streets and interviewing unhoused people. And you can see the tent in front of a building that's actually like a kind of a high-end apartment building in downtown Los Angeles with a now leasing sign. We have housing, we have plenty of it. We have more housing than more vacant units than unhoused people. It's all at the high end of the market.
Yeah.
And that gets back to something that I mentioned in passing earlier, which is that we treat housing not as a right, but as a way of accumulating wealth. Um,
Yeah, the financialization of housing, it's a widget now, and it's allowed to be a widget for speculation, for the accumulation of capital, for the stowing away of capital. And, as an anecdotal aside, with the fires having just taken out whole parts of the county of LA, insurance companies, those who've been lucky enough to get any support from their insurance companies, are being put in some of these mostly vacant high rises in downtown LA and Koreatown and places like that. And what that says is exactly what you were saying, is that there actually is housing in Los Angeles, but these buildings are unaffordable and people can't live in them. And it's such a fundamental and obvious failure, and also helps dispel some of the kind of YIMBY movement, which I don't even think we want to get into. But it goes back to a question you asked earlier about Skid Row. And like I said, it's very articulated in Skid Row. But one of the things that is coming up for me, which really speaks to what you're saying about how vast the undercount is, and unfortunately, saying 6 to 7 people dying a day, that's also, to me, a gross undercount. Because how does one define cause of death when we're talking about housing instability and poverty? The cause and effect, I think, is much greater and deserves more dialogue, I think, in many different spaces. But you talked about Skid Row, where it's concentrated. LA doesn't have a very well designed grid. So there are only a few really big thoroughfares that span the length of the county. And you can think of a few off the head: Figueroa, Alameda, Western, Sepulveda, in the north part of in the northern part of the county, northeastern part of the county into the north central part of the county, Colorado Boulevard. If you were to walk these thoroughfares, you will see right now, and I mean it right now, you will see people living in their cars. And these are not people who would ever claim to be unhoused or submit to a kind of survey or report, because it's either very new, they're not going to want to identify with that, they're not going to want people to know that. It is almost a very kind of covert thing they're doing. And in some ways, you'd almost have to look closely. And by the way, I'm not encouraging anyone to do this, leave people alone and mind your own business, but you will see it. It's happening. And again, goes to where we know the numbers are much lower than they want to profess. And again, we have so many warring political interests I shouldn't say political interests because their interests are all the same politically, but warring for political establishment who want to have a stake in saying they're helping address the issue. Which brings me to my other point that I think you have a lot to offer on, is that we're constantly subjected to this binary narrative of, red state versus blue state, red city versus blue city, and people saying, oh, you see, this is what happens in a Democrat run city. And my response is always like, yes, this is what happens in a Democrat run city, and it's also what happens in a Republican run city. And it's because they are both pushing the exact same policies. Quick example: about a year and a half ago, Governor Newsom put out his kind of vision for housing, or his vision for homelessness, I should say. And that same week, Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida put out his vision for homelessness, around homelessness, however you want to say it. And this was when they were both jockeying to be kind of the next prospective presidential candidate. So maybe this was more like 2 years ago when, DeSantis and Newsom were doing their kind of JV debates. What was not surprising, but didn't get talked about enough, is that their policy visions for homelessness were identical. They were presented differently, they were framed differently, but they were the exact same recommendations. And so you're doing a great job of dispelling. You've dispelled some of these myths really well, that it's not about drug use or mental health. As we know, if you go into a wealthy area where people are living in nice houses, there's probably more drug use happening there, and just as much, mental health kind of contention happening there as happens anywhere else. These are all elements of the human condition. So it's not mediated by one's own personal choices, it's mediated by class. But anything that you want to say around this kind of consistently beat drum around, Democrat run cities and Republican run cities, and how you've, parsed out some of these policy issues?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think we'll get into it later when we talk about criminalization, and certainly Gavin Newsom has been banging the drum and using his power to push for more criminalization and more sweeps, more destruction of property of unhoused people, and more making them disappear. But especially when we talk about the so the complicity of the services sector, and that's a strong word. It'd be good to hear the nuance of what I mean by that when we talk about the services sector, and particularly sort of the shelter vision. Because what's happening, so let's take the sort of extreme example, right? Donald Trump, right? Okay, like he's his public statements on what to do about homelessness, right, is to build like camps out in outside of cities, far away, and require unhoused people to go there, and they'll set up FEMA style tents, and they'll provide all the services that are needed. But basically, let's get people out of the cities, strict enforcement of laws criminalizing, and move people out to these camps. All right. Okay, that's should be setting off alarm bells for anyone who's a student of history and who thinks about believes in some like vision of freedom and liberty, and
Right.
like sending people to camps that are essentially like jails, because of their poverty and because they don't have housing. But then you look at the liberal solutions. Well, we're gonna make people go into shelters or hotels that are filled with all of these rules, that when I talk to people who had experienced the hotels or the safe camping sites, which is like a parking lot surrounded by barbed wire where you have a painted square on the concrete where you can put up your tent, and you get searched going in and out of the place, and you have curfews, all these kind of, it's not quite jail, but it's got these features of a jail to it. right? That's the liberal, the sort of blue state solution. Um, it's not all that different, right? It's a little less. We're all concentrating you in these camps in these one place, but it's still a carceral solution. The rhetoric they use is, well, it's all about care. We're going to take care of people. We're going to save their lives by getting them off the streets. And that's not to say that some people really desperately need to get indoors, even if it means enduring some harsh rules because they could die on the streets. But that's not for everybody. And it's this very carceral solution to a problem of poverty. And that's really troubling. And that's, there's, again, we'll hopefully get to it a little more later, but the Supreme Court case Grants passed that basically said, hey, uh, police, cities, counties can criminalize without limitation, without offering shelter. There was a bipartisan call for it. Governor Newsom, the mayor of San Francisco, the county of Los Angeles, all filed briefs saying, yeah, change the interpretation of our Constitution to allow criminalization. They put it as, oh, we're doing all these other things, but we need this as a tool in our toolbox, but it becomes the primary tool that they use.
Yeah, the divestment in other tools, if you will, and the disinvestment in other tools, and the bureaucratic incompetence, or in these days, do we even have bureaucracy? Now we just have contracting away to these, multinational fly-by-night firms, leaves one tool, which is the warehousing of people or the complete negligence and ignoring of people. And frankly, that's what we're living, and that's the driving force. It's not some imagined fantasy of liberal policymakers versus conservative policymakers, and that fantasy that there is some huge difference or a difference at all, frankly, I think has created a lot of political confusion for people, and is part of why I believe this report that you've done is so important and so significant.
Yeah, the warehousing is really what they are doing, what they agree on. And there's talk, well, we're providing services, um and sometimes they are, right? And sometimes they are able to move people through these hotels, shelters into permanent housing, but at a very low level and at the cost of the really brutal policy of sweeps and criminalization.
I have another question, but I don't want to stop you from getting to the next slide. So
Okay.
let me ask it, and then let's put a pin in it though, because I know
Okay.
it's going to be answered by some of what you're talking about. But we've seen when people are offered a chance to vote for things that are progressive, they usually do vote for them if they're told the truth about them. That's one of the good things about people. One thing that's happened a lot in LA and in other places that people have voted for resources to go to do something about housing, and then we don't see it reach the people that it's supposed to reach. And so there's this question on everyone's mind. And again, I'm not asking you to answer this right now. I'm asking you, I'm putting it into our space, which is, where'd that money go?
Yeah. I mean, some of it goes, much of it has gone to actually getting people housed. Like there are success stories and there have been good government interventions. I mean, things like um, Measure H actually got a lot of services to people and has helped build a sector that's had some effectiveness in helping people. Triple H has built a certain amount of housing, whether it's done efficiently and in the best way possible is a whole other story. And part of that is there's a system outside of the local control for developing housing, but that is yeah, it's important to look at, like, when people have in Los Angeles have very definitely supported some good measures, and those good measures have helped.
Thank you.
So should we do one more slide and
Do
then
one more slide, and then I
okay.
think we can, yeah, let's do one more slide.
Okay, so it's really important to understand that the housing crisis is very much a function of structural racism within the United States, within Los Angeles. And the report spends some time getting into the history and the present of it, right? The criminalization dates back to laws. It's really interesting. Something that I learned that I had never known was the federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles is on the site where there used to be a slave market. And what it was there was a law in, and this may have been even pre-statehood California, I forget, that said if a native person was indigent, right, didn't was basically found not working for someone, that they could then essentially be pressed into marginally paid labor, essentially as slaves. And so this was where businesses would come to get their workers that they really didn't have to pay and who were being pressed into that labor. We can look at, and the report breaks down some of the history of how things that we hear about redlining, right? How the federal government had during the New Deal had invested huge amounts of money into helping people buy homes, and but the federal government had strict rules where they defined who would get the loan guarantees and who wouldn't, right? Who was a safe investment and who wasn't. And basically it was done on racial lines. Black communities were mapped, and you can see on the slide, there's the map. Where the red part is, those are where the Black communities were, and those were the not safe to be invested in, whereas the green and the yellow tended to be the white communities, and that's where they were investing the money. So the housing segregation that we see in Los Angeles, which is pretty stark and has been as long as I've been here, it didn't just happen, right? There was migration. Black people migrated to Los Angeles. There have been several waves of migration. And due to some of the structural, like the formal legal systems, but also things like zoning. Most of Los Angeles is single family zoned, which makes it hard to build apartment buildings, which means you have to be more wealthy to buy land, and that works against not non-white people who don't have the same access to intergenerational wealth, as well as private discrimination, things like restrictive covenants. They said this is a whites only neighborhood. Those were very prominent in Los Angeles until relatively recently. All that has resulted in a housing crisis that's very much concentrated among Black, and now even more or a rising level in the Latino community. Some of the data points among the unhoused, the Black population of Los Angeles is around 8%, but about 1/3 of the unhoused population are Black. Black people are 6 times more likely than white people to be unhoused. This is not by accident, right? There's a long history that includes some of the things that you discussed before, the drug wars and various over policing, underfunding of schools in Black communities, things of that nature that have all sort of led to this situation where houselessness is very much cut along racial lines, which is not to say there's not plenty of white people who are living on the streets and who are undergoing the same difficulties and traumas. But it is very, very disproportionately and not by accident a Black issue. And particularly you look at Skid Row is one of the most highest concentration of Black folks in the city, and also a center of houselessness.
That's right. And with just the just kind of vicious gentrification that Los Angeles is experiencing. Skid Row is the only growing Black community in Los Angeles. Housing is very racialized. State violence in general, in the whole United States, and of course in Los Angeles, is very racialized. And it goes to your point about how services, when you say not necessarily efficient, we know that giving housing works. And it's interesting too, though, what becomes racialized and also very articulated along class lines. And this will be my last question before we decide to wrap up. And there's so much report to get to, so I think we're going to need a part two. But a lot of how, kind of, you mentioned earlier the futility and ineffectiveness of the shelter services, and that goes into even, housing in quotations being very conditional, and they put extremely kind of undignified conditions on housing for a lot of people, especially Black folks and especially folks who are low income, poor, etc. And the right to housing in perpetuity, the right to housing with dignity, is the actual clear answer and will solve the problem, but it so often, if ever, is offered. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that, because I think a lot of people don't know or understand the reality of how oppressive the conditions are put on people when offered some version of housing.
Yeah, no, and that's definitely something we can discuss more in part two. But I mean, imagine, I discussed it earlier. You have a curfew. You're an adult and you have a curfew, right? You have to be in by 7 o'clock, or you're not allowed into the hotel room that's been provided, or not allowed into the shelter, right? Well, what happens if your job, and people should know that a large percentage of people living on the streets or in their cars or in shelters are working. They have jobs. They can't afford housing. If you have a job that keeps you past 7 o'clock, or a commute from a job that keeps you past 7 o'clock, you either can't keep the job, or you might get kicked out of um, the housing that you've been offered. You know, people who put in the hotels under, say, Mayor Bass's Inside Safe, or the previous project Room Key, would complain that would state they're not allowed to go to the next room to visit, to speak to someone. They're not allowed to have a guest in their room, right? These are adults, right? These aren't prisoners in theory. These aren't children who need to be controlled. Not that children need to be controlled in that way, but right, they can only bring in 2 bags of their own property. Rules like this, can't even have their own key. Um, all these things that are sort of stripping a person of their dignity. I think that's the word used, and of their sort of control of their own lives. And that's very much not a solution. That's criminalization. That's essentially saying you're warehoused, you're jailed. Not the same as county jail, but on that spectrum. And I think maybe that's a good segue. Our next section is going to really break down, talking about criminalization and what that means and its impact, and also then a little bit more about the solutions that we know really work, which is getting people into housing, or keeping people in their housing.
Well, it tees up our part two really well, actually, because I think we can go into the criminalization conversation next, because it's so prescient. And again, not everything gets to be broken down into a binary, but the binary of what happens when people experience things through a court system versus not through a court system are completely night and day. And I mean, that's redundant, completely night and day. They are night and day, and the impacts are severe in both directions. So I want to thank you very much. We are All People's Health Collective. We will make sure that the access to John Rafling's report will be easy. We will put it up on all of our socials and all of our platforms. And this is just the beginning, and we are really excited to continue to dig into this analysis and to really, really take an earnest approach to how we discuss these issues that we know can be solved and can make things far better. So thank you again for letting us dip into your report a little bit, and we look forward to more.
Yeah, thanks, Lex. Always great talking to you.